The light came first, and I felt the ground leave beneath my feet. One moment I was standing on the slope above the harbor watching the ship burn. The next, everything turned white. Something struck my chest and lifted me backward. My boots left the stone. I saw the sky where the street had been. There was no sound at first. Then I hit the road hard. I couldn't breathe properly for a moment. I tried to pull air into my chest, but it would not come. Pressure built inside my head, deep and heavy, and then the sound arrived. It was thick and full and seemed to move through the ground itself. When I opened my eyes, I looked toward the harbor. The ship was gone. Minutes earlier, I had been walking toward the waterfront on my way to work. The air was cold and still. Smoke was rising above the buildings before I saw the flames. People ahead of me slowed in the street and pointed toward the water. I looked toward the harbor and saw the ship near the pier, flames moving steadily across its deck. It did not look out of control. The flames stayed low. Smoke climbed almost straight upward. The water around the hull was flat. There was no wind pushing sparks toward the warehouses. That was why I did not turn back. I crossed the road and joined the others climbing the slope above the harbor. From there, we could see the full length of the ship. I stood near the railing with my hands in my coat pockets. Men around me were speaking quietly. One of them said the harbor crews would handle it. Another said ships caught fire from time to time and were contained before they spread. Everyone could see the ship was burning. We believed it was under control. On the deck, small figures moved through the smoke. Water arced from hoses. The fire shifted but did not race. Behind us, doors opened along the street. Boots struck pavement. A woman lifted her child so he could see over the crowd. Down the hill, a tram had stopped in the road, passengers leaning forward against the glass. No one was shouting. The docks were not burning. The warehouses stood untouched. Sparks lifted into the air and died before reaching land. The longer it burned, the less urgent it felt. More people gathered behind us. Men who had been heading to work slowed and joined the line along the slope. A few climbed onto low walls to see better. We stood shoulder to shoulder, bodies pressed together, all facing the water. A section of the deck collapsed inward. Smoke burst upward and then folded back down. Several people stepped back. Most of us leaned forward instead. We were sure that if it became dangerous, someone would tell us to leave. We expected an order to evacuate the area. Someone even mentioned that the ship was carrying dangerous cargo. Another dismissed it, but there were still no warnings, no sounds, no whistles, no official orders. I turned my attention back to the ship and watched more carefully. The fire moved deeper into the vessel. The smoke darkened. It stopped rising cleanly and began to roll sideways for the first time. I was no longer able to see the people on deck. Still, the hull remained upright. The water stayed calm. People pressed closer. I felt their weight against my shoulders. The tram had not moved. Faces were still visible behind the smoke-streaked glass. We kept waiting for someone to tell us to move. Then, the fire reached the cargo below deck. The next second looked exactly like the one before it. Until it didn't. The light came. Now, pushing myself up from the shattered street, I saw what that single second had done. Glass covered the slope in a thick layer. Windows behind us had burst inward. Empty frames hung over the road. Curtains were tangled in splintered wood. Sections of brick wall lay across the pavement. People lay where they had been thrown. Some were trying to rise, some were crawling, some were completely still. My ears rang so loudly I could not hear my own voice. My coat was torn at the shoulder. Dust and fragments of timber were scattered across the stone around me. I turned toward the harbor. Where the ship had been, there was only a towering column of smoke and debris. The pier was gone. Boats had been lifted and overturned. Metal and timber fell from the sky and struck the water with heavy splashes. The force had traveled outward in every direction at once. Houses along the waterfront were torn open. Roofs had lifted and collapsed. Doors were ripped from their hinges. The tram down the road had been forced off its track, its windows shattered. I stumbled down the slope toward the railing where I had been standing minutes earlier. The railing was bent and twisted. A man nearby pressed his hands to his face, blood running from cuts made by flying glass. Another was pinned beneath a fallen beam, pulling at wood that would not move. When I finally managed to draw a full breath, it burned in my chest. The crowd that had stood shoulder to shoulder was gone. The place where we had watched the fire was buried under debris. The stone beneath my boots was split. Wood, brick, and glass were scattered across the hill. Below us, the harbor lay flattened. Buildings that had been standing only moments earlier were torn open and half collapsed. Smoke drifted low across the water. Smaller fires burned along the shoreline where debris had landed. People staggered in different directions. Some carried the injured. Others stood still, turning slowly as if trying to understand what had been there before. The tram driver pulled himself upright inside the wrecked carriage. Passengers climbed out through empty window frames onto a road covered in glass. Sound returned in pieces. Shouting, crying, the crackle of new fires catching in dry timber. I looked once more toward the water. There was no ship, no pier, no crowd along the railing. Only smoke rising from a harbor that had been whole less than a minute earlier. I stepped carefully through shattered brick and splintered beams toward the edge of the hill. A shard of glass was embedded in the wood where my hand had been resting before the blast. The slope where we had stood was no longer a place to stand. The street behind us was open to the sky, and for a moment it was silent again.